In today's lecture, I want to make two general points about how we learn. First, we seldom, if ever, learn passively by letting things wash over us. Learning does happen without our awareness, but even in that case, learning happens as we're engaged in purposeful action. We're pursuing other goals. And the learning that happens in those circumstances is affected by the goals we're pursuing. Second, we learn in addition to everything else we already know. And what we already know changes our experiences as we learn. Now, as we've discussed already, these two aspects of learning posed a profound challenge to early theories because goals and prior experience are hard to observe. They're also foundational to much of what we will discuss through the remainder of the class. I'm going to begin with goals or purposes and how they affect learning. And then I'll consider some illustrations of how past experience shapes current and future learning. Remember that if we think about learning in information processing terms, we might draw a kind of line from a stimulus in the environment, a piece of information, an image, or a sound, through a series of transformations and repetitions based on previous knowledge and experience. And in the end, that line ultimately ends up in learning. Now, the stimulus can be anything defined in terms of energy, like sound waves or light waves, and that energy is transformed into a sensory experience by our sensory systems, and then further into what we call a perception. We may combine perceptions into then more complex representations of our surroundings or into complex actions and reactions. And this process is what we've been calling encoding. Representations and actions that we store and can then generate on our own, independently of the environment, independently of a stimulus, are considered learned. And that's what we've called retrieval, that process of generating the representation independently of needing the stimulus. Now, goals shape what we learn as we go through experiences. And as you can imagine, goals are going to affect everything at each stage in this sort of processing line that I'm trying to draw out for you. Now, sometimes the goal really is simply to learn about our environment and what the available options are. But at other times, the goal is going to be more narrowly focused, and the learning that occurs happens more incidentally with maybe more limited usefulness. But that learning is also shaped by the goals we're pursuing as we engage with our environment. You may remember the example of the grocery clerk from earlier in the course. Her purpose was everyday recognition of you as a customer. She wasn't learning your face to be able to pick you out in the crowd or as you were wearing multiple disguises. She wasn't a private investigator. One generality about learning is that we learn what we need to learn to engage in our everyday actions. When we don't need to learn, we may actually not learn anymore. For example, we're no longer as likely to memorize people's phone numbers. As a child, or actually a teenager, I learned my friends' phone numbers by rote memorization. Because at that time, if you didn't learn the numbers, you had to look them up every time in the phone book. And if you didn't have the phone book handy or your friend's number was unlisted, you weren't going to be able to call your friends. Now, we no longer do this because we need only type a phone number one time into our cell phones, and then we can call that person anytime we want to. In many cases, we don't even need to dial that number at all. So one way to think about this is that when the goal of being able to stay in touch with friends can be met without memorizing phone numbers, we no longer invest effort, time, or energy in learning the numbers, and we actually don't learn them. Or consider this. A student once asked me how to get to the biology department on my campus. I knew and had learned many landmarks on my campus at that point, but here's how I learned them. They were either relevant to my work, the location of my own building, the classroom building where I taught, the dean's office for my college, the best cafeteria for lunch, and the library. Or the places I knew would be relevant to my non-work life as a runner, the best road to reach a nearby park, and so on. Now, I had no goals or needs involving the biology building. So, as it turns out, I didn't know where it was located or what it looked like. And this was true despite the fact that I'd been walking by it every day for 6 years. Now, some of the more fun illustrations of this aspect of learning in respect to goals come from work on learning about a series of events when we vary the goals people have for learning about them. One of my favorite example studies is this. You might show people a set of relationship events that occur between a man and a woman. And let's just say, for the sake of thinking about this problem, first meeting, a first kiss, an argument about commitment, infidelity on the part of the man, hostile and angry treatment on the part of the woman, infidelity on the part of the woman, additional infidelity on the part of the man, culminating in conflict and a decision to divorce. Now, this is not a very happy story, I know, but it has a lot of drama, and that's kind of nice for an experiment where you ask people to learn things. Now, imagine that for some of the people, I asked them to learn about this list of events, to learn this relationship history, while serving as the divorce lawyer for the woman. Now, for others, I might ask them to do the same thing, learn this relationship history, but serving as the lawyer for the man. Now, as you might imagine, when I later ask these people to tell me what happened in the relationship, to test what they've learned, people's learning of the events turns out to be partisan. The divorce lawyer for the woman underlearns and actually underestimates the negative actions of his client relative to the other party. So one point that can be made over and over and over again from research findings in psychology is that purposeful behavior shapes our learning, even when learning isn't our central purpose. Now, we'll revisit this issue in future lectures as we consider some findings on second language vocabulary acquisition and the role of attention in learning more generally. But I would leave you with an erroneous conclusion if we stop considering purposes at this point, because one of the interesting things about most species that have been studied is this: human beings and other animals engage in a lot of spontaneous exploration. And in fact, the exploration of our environments, and in our case that means both our physical and our social environments, is a major motivating force for us. In other words, we often do have a chronic goal of learning. How do we know this? In the 1950s, a young psychologist named Montgomery proposed that animals have two conflicting motivations: a drive to explore, which we might call curiosity, and another motive, which you might think of as a fear of the unknown. If you have ever paused for a moment outside the door to the building where you're about to start a new job or a new school, you've probably experienced a moment where both of these motives were very strong, very salient for you. Now, Montgomery posited that the curiosity drive was innate and that it's aroused by novelty. That is, whenever you encounter something new, you experience curiosity or an interest in learning. In one study, he and some colleagues showed that rats would learn a T-shaped maze much more quickly if they were rewarded with the opportunity to explore a more complicated maze. So getting to learn something more interesting actually serves as a reward. Montgomery also did something quite interesting. He varied rats' experiences in early life, and he showed that rats who had a more complicated and rich environment when they were young actually get interested and curious in complicated environments, but not in simple new environments. So to some extent, what's novel and what stimulates curiosity depends a little bit on what you've experienced up until that point in your life. Human infants begin exploring almost from the beginning of life, even when their ability to move and their ability to see and hear and smell and taste are very limited. And this exploration has many functions, but it looks like it's rewarding in and of itself for babies to understand their environment and what it offers. So if you think about young infants, in the newborn to 6-month phase, their ability to sit up or move, or in some cases even hold their head up, is fairly limited. One of the biggest changes in a young baby's behavior happens at the point where the baby is able to grasp an object. Now, prior to this point, babies spend a lot of time looking at things and mouthing things that they're offered because that's what they're able to do. Once they can grasp an object, babies spend a lot of time doing so. And any of us who've ever played with a baby know that they like to grab your fingers, or your keys, your glasses, or anything that they can reach. And this grasping actually lets babies link how an object feels in the hand with how it looks to the eyes. And any parent's going to tell you that Once babies move from grasping to crawling or walking, there is no stopping their exploration. Based on what I've said so far, you may think that exploration is the province of the young. But recently, my mother phoned me to enthuse about a recently opened grocery store in our city. Now, there are 3 large grocery stores within about 2 miles of her house, and together with some ethnic food stores, she's already able to buy any food items she might need. But the opening of a new store was a cause for exploration. It's a novel stimulus and it provoked curiosity, followed by the need to share what she'd learned with others. What prices and items were available? Did the produce look better than at other places? Was there more variety? Were the employees nice? Now, all of these pieces of information are completely unnecessary, but the act of exploration alone, the act of learning something new about her environment, was a motivator for my mother. And this is true for most of us in our daily lives, at least in some areas. So exploration is at least a lifelong possibility, although we are going to return later in this class to the question of whether exploration is uniquely salient in infancy and childhood as compared to later adulthood. Now, we touched on this in the first lecture when we promised to talk about the myth that you can't teach an old dog new tricks. The purposes we have as we go through our day and the purpose of exploration itself are not the only things people bring with them to a learning situation. Learning is not only purposeful, it's also driven to some extent by what we already know. The second major point of this lecture is that there is no tabula rasa in learning. So what we learn doesn't just come in and imprint some as yet unused piece of the brain. What we learn instead is a result of what we've already learned. Consider those rats who had complicated environments in rat puphood. They didn't find a simple maze very rewarding as adults. It wasn't novel, it didn't offer them much to learn. So what we've learned is a result of what we'd already learned, and it also determines what we're going to go on to learn next. Now, to see how this works, let's revisit that line representing information processing. That line from a stimulus in the environment, a piece of information, an image, a sound, through a series of transformations and repetitions that ultimately results in learning. As you can see, just as with goals, there are numerous points along that continuum where we might see the importance of past experience in shaping present perception and representation, and, by extension, learning. One is in the transformation of stimulus energy into sensation and perception. Some of the most compelling experiments here look at the connection between early deprivation and the ability to sense or perceive parts of the visual environment. The logic of these studies is straightforward. Researchers vary whether a particular experience happens or doesn't happen, and then they look at whether that experience matters for a later ability to perceive or sense the environment, for example, in later visual perception. And it turns out experience matters quite a bit for later visual perception. Some early studies deprived kittens of a certain type of visual stimulation at a point in early kittenhood where visual perception is developing. For example, researchers might make sure that a kitten never sees horizontal lines. At this point, you can see why much of this work has been done with animals, because it's difficult to control a human being's environment that thoroughly. Now, if you do this to a kitten, if you raise a kitten in the absence of horizontal lines, what you get is a kitten who actually can't perceive horizontal lines in the future. Now, if you're a visual perception researcher, this is the end of the story. But if you're interested in learning, we have to go one step further. Any kind of learning that requires the kitten to see horizontal lines is not going to be possible for this kitten. But for another kitten whose early perceptual experience was normal and included horizontal lines, learning that requires horizontal lines is perfectly doable, perfectly straightforward. Another example from visual perception concerns our ability to recognize faces. Interestingly, when people grow up in ethnically and racially homogeneous environments, they're actually less capable of recognizing individual faces of people who come from a different racial or ethnic group. And this phenomenon is called the same race bias. What it means is that it is more difficult to learn people's faces and possibly to associate names with those faces if they're from a different group. This bias can be overcome with exposure. So, as we see many diverse faces, we get better and better at discriminating between individual faces from people in an ethnic group that is different than our own. And in fact, this kind of perceptual learning, the ability to tell the difference between different stimuli with exposure, happens in many contexts, and we'll actually talk a little more about this kind of learning in the next lecture. So, perception, that basic initial phase of information processing and learning, is affected by our past experiences with stimuli. There is no tabula rasa, not even at the very beginning of information gathering for learning. Let's move a bit further along that processing path to the point where people need to take perceptions and combine them to create some meaningful representation. We learned some very interesting things about meaningful representations in early learning experiments that involve memory for words. So, in one early study by someone in Boesveld, participants were given mixed up lists of words from a variety of categories. For example, consider the following list: daisy, saucepan, cat, rose, frying pan, geranium, dog, hamster. Now, at this point in the experiment, I might ask you to tell me the words that I just told you. That is, to see which of the words you've learned. Now, people do something quite interesting when you ask them to say these words. Rather than repeat the words back in order, they often do so organizing the words by category. In other words, people presented with this task say rose, geranium, daisy, saucepan, frying pan, cat, dog, hamster. So they've spontaneously organized the list of kind of unrelated words into 3 categories. And this kind of finding tells us people are making use of what they already know to organize their learning. That is, they know that some of these words belong together because they're flowers, and they know that some of these words belong together because they're equipment used in cooking, and other words belong together because they're all animals. And so they're using their category knowledge to organize their learning. And this is quite adaptive because it turns out that if you use categories when you're trying to learn a list of words, you'll actually improve your learning. Now, a different researcher named Barsalou did a different experiment, and he asked people in this case to generate categories from arbitrary lists of words. For example, I'm going to give you a list of 4 words: children, dog, stereo, blanket. What category might encompass these 4 items? Think for just a minute. People given this task came up with a variety of things. For example, some people said, these are things to take from your house in case of a fire. Others said, these are the things you take to the park. You can get very creative with this task, and I think it's actually kind of a good party game. But what you can see is that people actually can make enormously inventive use of what they already know, of their own past experience, to create a meaningful way of connecting a list of items that on the surface are just unrelated. Another example from memory research involves making up funny sentences to help remember an arbitrary list, like, the dog and the cat put the hamster in the frying pan after boiling him in the saucepan, and they served him up with rose, geranium, and daisy petals. This strategy for learning makes use of your knowledge about sentences and about language, and it also makes use of surprising visual imagery in ways that you actually know are ridiculous, and even the ridiculousness relies on what you know about what is normal. So, people have to make use of their own prior knowledge in order to use categories to help them learn and remember lists of words. Now, once they do so, they are prone to some distinctive and interesting errors. For example, I might present the following list of words to you and ask you to learn them: bed, nightlight, reading lamp, pillow, blanket, dream. Later, when I ask you what words you were asked to learn, you're very likely to recall that I asked you to learn the word sleep. This is a very robust finding, by which we mean This is a very easy finding to repeat with different participants and different studies. Remembering that you learned the word sleep in this list is what researchers call a false memory. In fact, the word sleep is not on the list. What happened? You spontaneously used a category you have, things related to bedtime and sleeping, to organize the words you were given as you learned them. And later, this organization actually makes you better at remembering the items that I gave you to learn. It also makes you vulnerable to the error of remembering that sleep was on the list. So far, we've talked about how what we already know can help us make sense of, organize, and learn lists of words in a more effective way. And you can imagine similar approaches with pictures or other lists of concepts. Now, a more pointed illustration of this comes from the work of Sir Frederick Bartlett in the early 1900s on people's ability to learn a folk tale from a culture quite different than their own. To do this, Bartlett presented British adults with a series of folk tales drawn from native cultures in other parts of the world, including Native American cultures, and he asked the British adults to learn and then retell the tales, and he used those retellings to look at their learning and their ability to retain what they had learned. One of the stories was called The War of the Ghosts. This is a North American indigenous folktale, and Bartlett knew his participants had never heard it and wouldn't be familiar with it. So they couldn't draw on their specific prior knowledge of the story to help them learn and remember the details. Now, the second key thing about the War of the Ghosts is that it's difficult to understand in some places because the story actually requires you to understand a little bit about that originating culture's mythology and worldview. And in particular, it requires you to understand some assumptions like the following. Ghosts can come and talk to the living as though the ghosts are still alive and animate, and the living can be fooled about whether the ghosts are alive or dead. So the gist of the story is that the two young men are seal fishing, and they're approached by a party of warriors. Unbeknownst to these men, the warriors are ghosts. The warriors invite the two men to make war with them on a downriver group. One of the men refuses, but the other one actually goes along to war. In the ensuing fight, the young man is killed, but he doesn't seem to realize this, and he returns with the ghosts to his home village. He tells his story, and then he falls down, and a black thing flies from his mouth, and he is then, at that moment, recognized by his home tribe as being dead. Bartlett's participants read the story twice through, and then, 15 minutes later, he tested their retelling of the story to see what they had learned. So, how did prior knowledge, or in this case, the absence of the right prior knowledge, affect learning? Well, as I said, for Western Brits of the time, there were some things in the story that don't quite make sense. For example, Bartlett's British participants, they don't have this worldview in which ghosts walk around and get living people into trouble, and they also don't have the idea that people might not immediately recognize when someone's dead. So participants' retellings of the story actually distorted the meaning of the word ghost in the story in ways that were more consistent with what British participants believed about the world in general. For example, one participant reported that the warriors were accused of being ghosts. Another participant reported that the clan's name was Ghosts. Now, these are errors in what's been learned about the War of the Ghosts. But they're also errors that reflect the way that prior knowledge shapes what we understand about our situation and what we are able to learn. In fact, just as our knowledge about categories helps us to organize otherwise chaotic information, our knowledge about complex events and objects in the world, known as our schemata, help us to learn from experiences. Now, schemata are defined as abstract knowledge structures, and they include things like plans, event sequences, which are also called scripts. And just like in a play, a script tells you what happens in what order for some type of event like going to a restaurant or hosting a birthday party. For Bartlett's participants, their scripts for young men going off to war were probably something like your own. And the idea of ghosts making mischief and dead people walking are not part of those scripts. Rather, the script for young men going to war involves some sort of provocation, at a minimum an insult, which was one common distortion of the story. So what you already know shapes future learning. Prior knowledge affects how you learn new things. As I've said before, no tabula rasa. These knowledge structures were originally conceived of in computer science as people tried to figure out how to get computers to process information. And then they were applied to research on how human beings process information. Consider the following few sentences. John was feeling very hungry as he entered the restaurant. He settled himself at a table and noticed that the waiter was nearby. Suddenly, however, he realized that he'd forgotten his reading glasses. We know right away that this problem is relevant because the next step is for John to read a menu. Yet this hasn't been mentioned. We know it and we understand these sentences because we have a script in our minds. We have a representation of what's involved in going to a restaurant. Now, some of Schank and Abelson, two pioneers in this field, some of their early work involved trying to make computers that could read and understand prose based on being programmed with a script. Now, reading and understanding is not quite the same as learning, but as with all information processing ways of thinking about learning, reading and understanding is one of the important steps in encoding. How do we know something like a script or a set of expectations about what will happen and in what order? How do we know this exists in people's heads? There's a variety of ways of testing this idea, just as with testing whether there's something like a category in people's heads. For example, just like with the false memory for the word sleep earlier, and just like with Bartlett's example of misremembering the War of the Ghosts, we can ask people to learn and recall events, and we can look for false intrusions of script-relevant events that people were never told about. One example would be a false memory for a statement about menu reading in the event description above. In this sense, scripts are like categories. But scripts also have other information. That includes information about serial order or the expected order in which events occur. So in other studies of scripts, participants are given a series of event descriptions to learn, and researchers can present items in or out of sequence with that script. We develop a standard script by asking a whole bunch of people what happens when you go to a restaurant and aggregating their answers so that we know what steps are endorsed by most people and what order is endorsed by most people. And then if we present events in or out of order, people actually tend to distort the order of events so that it fits that kind of group script. So imagine, for example, that you were accepted to 2 graduate programs and you interviewed on each campus after being accepted. Now, in retelling this to someone else or remembering it much later in your life, you may in fact switch the order of the 2 events because the more canonical order, the more typical order of the script is to first interview and then be admitted. You might actually make this error and it would seem plausible to everyone, including you. It would just also happen to be false. A final piece of evidence that scripts are real is that when people are asked to generate a script or to draw inferences about what happens next in a story, they're more likely to choose something that's pretty central to the script rather than something that's more peripheral or could be left out. So if I ask you to generate a script for eating out in a restaurant, you'll include items like being seated, reading the menu, choosing something, waiting for the food, and asking for the bill. But you probably won't include things like visiting the bathroom or assessing the quality of the chairs and silverware, because these are things we do when we visit a restaurant, but they're peripheral to that main idea of having dinner out. And leaving them out suggests that scripts aren't just a memory for eating out, but they're actually a list of rules and events that are central to the event of eating out. What all this means for learning is that we approach any learning situation with prior knowledge and beliefs about categories and scripts, and these influence what we perceive, understand, learn, and later remember from material we're trying to learn. Now, as I said, 2 of the prominent features of prior knowledge are categories and scripts, although there are other kinds of prior knowledge. There are prior knowledge about body movements, scripts for muscle movements, for example, that also qualify as kinds of schemata and that also affect learning. In this lecture, we've emphasized the ways in which purposes and prior learning influence current learning. Now, you may be thinking, as I was when I first learned about the powerful role that scripts play in learning, you may be thinking, but where do we learn scripts? Well, the next lecture, we'll ask where and how we acquire categories and scripts, as surely these are also learned.